unless we expressed our thanks to the congregation. It's been an encouragement for us as young men and me to see a congregation at work, to be come in and welcomed by y'all and to be fed by y'all, and the conversations and the things that you're doing here is truly the Lord's work. And you're not friends, you're brothers and sisters, and we've been treated that way, and we appreciate that. May the Lord bless your work up here. We're thankful that you're a supporter of the school, and would ask your prayers for us as we continue to finish school and look for work. So thank you for that. For most of tonight's text, even though we'll be a lot of places, I hope to cover a lot of ground tonight. We'll be in Judges 1 and 2 and a few verses in 3. And the thing that I want us to learn in the outset of this is that if we're going to be following something or someone, we better know who we're following. I think of this young man that spent the night at a friend's house and a blizzard had blown in. Never been to this part of town before, and when he gets up in the morning, the snow is still so heavy, the visibility so low. And he remembered what his dad told him. Son, if you ever get caught in a blizzard, just find a snowplow. You get behind that snowplow and he's going to lead you to a road that will lead you home. Okay, that's pretty good. And so he finds a snowplow and he gets in behind this snowplow. And if the snowplow turned left, he turned left. And if the snowplow turned right, he turned right. And it goes on for the better part of an hour. And he said, I don't see any roads that are familiar to me. And the brake lights of the snowplow came on and his hazards came on. The driver gets out. Can I help you, son? He said, well, my dad told me if I follow a snowplow, eventually it would get out to a road. He said, well, I'm finished with this Walmart parking lot. If you want to follow me over to Best Buy. We got to make sure who we're following. And that's the problem that they run into with Judges. At one time, they were following God, and that road was going to lead them home. But they forgot. They didn't remember to follow. Let's set the stage in Joshua 23. Eric did a good job on Sunday morning talking about leadership, and we spent a lot of time talking about Joshua. In Joshua 23, he's at the end of his life, and he's given the final instructions for the people. And it's a message from God. He didn't make this message up. He's delivering it. It's a lengthy reading, but I think it's important to us. We'll start in verse 5 and go through verse 13. Joshua, again speaking to the Israelites, and the Lord your God, he shall expel them from before you. He's talking about Israel's enemies. And drive them out of your sight, and ye shall possess their land, as the Lord your God hath promised unto you. Be therefore very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that ye turn not aside therefrom to the right hand or to the left, that ye come not among these nations, these that remain among you, neither make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, neither serve them, nor bow yourselves unto them. Very plain language. But cleave unto the Lord your God, as ye have done unto this day. We might say, so far so good. For the Lord hath driven out from before you great nations and strong. But as for you, no man hath been able to stand before you unto this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000. For the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he hath promised you. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, that you love the Lord your God. Else if you do in any wise go back, and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land, which the Lord your God hath given you. Sadly enough, we'll get to a point to where when Paul's preaching a lesson and talks about this, that says that this cycle that these Israelites will enter into, the period of the Judges, will last 450 years. And none of it is what would we want in our lives. It's this cycle that continues to be sin against God that leads to suffering. That suffering begins to supplication, right? They get to the point to where they're crying out for a deliverer, and God is faithful enough to send one, and then they're delivered. But then, after the deliverer, they go back into the cycle of the sin and the suffering, and they pray out to him again, and he delivers them again. That wasn't his plan. And 450 years, we see this destructive cycle. Let's begin with some of the things that went wrong for them. I told you we'd be in the first part of Judges, so if it's in your lap, open to that. I want you to look at one of the things that God told them to do. He said, when you get into the land, they've already been defeat after defeat in a good sense, God giving them victories. And he says, when you get in there, I want you to drive out the inhabitants completely. So let's look and see how they did on that. In Judges, we'll skip over to verse 27 because we saw Judah go into the land and start to have some success at driving them out. And now it's kind of like, okay, go finish the job. And so what happens in verse 27? Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants. In verse 28, did not utterly drive them out. In verse 29, neither did Ephraim drive them out. In verse 30, neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of the land. And neither did Asher in verse 31, and neither did Naphtali in verse 33. I think we get the point, right? They didn't drive out these inhabitants, and so what's left for them? If you're around sin long enough, before you know it, you're going to be in it. Paul would write to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15:33, I believe Noah quoted it the other night, be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good morals. As we say in Little Rock, if you lie down with the dogs, you're going to get up with fleas. And we understand that when we have these close communications, we're not the ones winning the influence battle. Most of the time they are. So why be in it? Compromise today leads to trouble tomorrow. And when you're talking about what's applicable to us today about driving out the inhabitants, how about the inhabitants of ignorance? Do we know God's word? Do we know his will for us? When we're driving out the inhabitants that God wants us to, we're talking about weakness. Maybe I do have some knowledge. I'm converted. I'm trying to live that life, but I keep falling into these same sins that are before me. You need to drive out weakness. And in the third place, there's the inhabitant of rebellious attitude. Sometimes we just get tired and we rebel against God. We just don't want to fight anymore. We need to seek to drive those inhabitants out. Think about sin and this idea of laying down with the dogs and getting up with fleas. Lot is a good biblical illustration of how that is. Let's look at Genesis 13. God had blessed Lot. God had blessed Abraham. Their herds had gotten so big that their herdsmen started to fight with each other, and they realized for the betterment of keeping the relationship between uncle and nephew, let's go our separate ways. Abraham, the wiser, probably confident that he would be taken care of, says, Lot, you choose. Well, how did Lot choose? I think if it's me and I had the true respect, the older, wiser uncle should probably go first, but that's not what happened. Lot makes the choice, but how did he make it? We don't read anywhere where he goes before God and says, please bless me in this decision. How many decisions do you and I leave God out of? But look what he does in verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. It was what was pleasing to his eyes, the externals. Okay, what happens next? Let's look in verse 12. It says in verse 12 that Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain. The cities of the plain, but first he was looking out toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and he beheld how beautiful that was. Now he's in the region, if you will. He's in the plains, getting closer to Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens in the next part of the verse, in verse 12? Then he pitched his tent toward Sodom. Man, it's too good for him to resist, and he's getting closer and closer. At any time, he should have just stopped. But let's look in chapter 14 and verse 12. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's sons, who dwelt in Sodom, with his goods, and departed. So now Lot, who was looking at it, he pitched his tent toward it. Now he's in it. But it goes even further. Let's turn over to Genesis 19 as we're following Lot's progression. And it's the same for us when we get into sin, that when we leave God. Now in chapter 19, verse 1, and there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gates of Sodom. And at first glance, well, you've already told us he's in, but leadership sat in the gates. So not only is he in Sodom, now he's among the respected. And even though the New Testament will say righteous Lot, that he was able to fend off sin, he's one of the righteous men that Abraham would beg for that would get out of Sodom. But it is not going all that well. Look at verse 31 in the same chapter. He goes from the leader of being Sodom to what? With his daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. He dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. So he goes from being in leadership in Sodom, which is a place he shouldn't have been in the first place. He's gone from the highest of the highs as far as life goes, down into the lows. He's dwelling in a cave. But the worst part of it is that he got his daughters out of Sodom, but he did not get the Sodom out of the daughters. They would get their father drunk and lie with him, and 2 children, one from each daughter, would come from that, Moab and Ben-Ammi. And I want you to take those 2 names, and we're going to take a pen and we're going to put them over here on the wall because we will come back to them. But just remember what happens in these movements of sin. I'm reminded of Psalm 1:1. And in this particular chapter, it's talking about the blessed man that doesn't do things. So it's only natural and right for us to assume that there are people that are unblessed, if you will use the word, that do the opposite of those things. So look at the verse in Psalm 1:1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of the sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And I want you to think about the posture that's being discussed here and the way that these men, how sin goes. That first they are walking in the counsel of the godly. There's movement in a direction. And the next thing you know, they've stopped walking and now they're standing. And then at the last, they're sitting and they're in the midst. And when I try to leave that, the easiest position for me to leave sin is when I'm walking, because I can just change direction and move away from it. But if I'm standing now with the sinners, I have to then begin walking and then change my direction